Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. Work has already begun on revising New Mexico's social studies standards for students in the state. Here to share more is New Mexico Public Education Deputy Secretary, Dr.Gwen Perea Warniment, who has been heavily involved with much of this work. Dr. Perea Warniment, I want to thank you so much for joining us for the program. Why does the Public Education Department feel that these standards need to be updated?
Thank you, Anthony, for having me. It's a privilege to be here. This is a very critical, important work for two reasons. First is these standards are outdated and need revision. It's best practice to go ahead and take a look at the academic standards that you have in place and revise them at a minimum every 15 years. And we're overdue with social studies. The second reason is because we know that there's a national trend where it's an emphasis on civic education that has been maybe put to the side in general, as schools and school systems have heavily focused on English language arts and math for the past 10 years.
Okay, so I don't think we can talk about revising social studies standards without talking about the landmark court decision that New Mexico is facing, the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit. A state district judge ordered New Mexico to make immediate changes and steps to fix schools and education to fully support low-income, Native American, Hispanic, English language learners and special needs students in the state. Do you feel that these changes could help address that lawsuit?
Sure, that's a great question and excellent point. Yes, the answer is a definitive yes. Social studies, as you know, is the story of ourselves. And so when we have a more diverse, all-encompassing, historically accurate set of social studies standards that reflect who we are as a people, as a state, and as a nation, we're better off. And so addressing the lawsuit is in particularly tied to correct academic standards that are rigorous, but also tell the truth.
Okay, so let's talk about the standard changes. You mentioned civics being a big part. Can you share with us what are going to be the major changes that students can expect to be learning once this is implemented?
Sure. Civics is a larger emphasis across the entire spectrum of kindergarten through 12th grade, rather than embedded in certain grade levels. In addition, there's a heavier emphasis on economics. We know that's an important component, particularly financial literacy for our students. In addition, you'll see that there's a broader representation of multiple perspectives around a particular event. I'll give you an example. Let's take something like the Santa Fe Trail, which we know about in our history, rather than having it from a singular perspective of pioneers that might have come into New Mexico. How do you analyze, how do you approach that event, that factual event, from multiple perspectives, given the range of people who were impacted from that? So including Native Americans, the Spanish colonists who were here at the time. So a really broader understanding and getting to a deeper level of inquiry and critical thinking for students. So part of this is also asking for students and educators to teach in a way that gets at a deeper, more profound level of analysis and understanding.
I want to talk with you about critical race theory. Obviously, some folks may be aware of that term being used a lot, especially in politics recently. An academic framework that legal scholars in higher education may be studying, which examines racism in our society. Can you share with us about how that may be implemented in some of these standards?
Certainly. My answer would be that it's not implemented in these standards. I think there's confusion around what is critical race theory and what is historically accurate standards within the K-12 space and representation of the entire diversity of our students. So as you just said, critical race theory is a lens of analysis that's used by scholars and researchers, professors, and others to analyze major systems like the law or the housing industry or banking. You can also use critical racism to look at the education system, and we can say the policies that our public education system had in terms of boarding schools with Indigenous students, that was a racist policy. So I can use that if I'm looking at a major system. It does not have a space in K-12 education or within these social studies standards. Rather, the social studies standards simply reflect what is historically accurate in terms of we need to reckon with power dynamics that happened within the span of our own history in the nation. And I'm going to give you an example here. Let's say that I'm looking at the American Revolution. Power dynamics and an understanding of that space already exist when we look at the analysis that our history teachers and our students embark on when they look at the relationship between England and the American colonists and the fight for freedom. That is actually all about power dynamics and about the seek for freedom. We need to do the same thing internally with some of the historical events that have happened within America, within our state.
Okay, let's talk about the process. Can you kind of give us an update on where the state is exactly at with implementing these new standards? Who's involved in revising these standards?
Certainly. We began the process last fall. The first thing we did was look at who are the experts in this space in New Mexico. And that includes faculty, higher ed faculty who really have a profound understanding, lead research in history education, in ethnic studies, in geography, civics. So we culled together a really strong advisory council who could lead us by establishing a vision for what social studies might mean for us. We started there, and then we went and had asked for some support in terms of facilitation from a national vendor. We looked at where has there been revision of social studies standards in what states and who's led that work or supported. I really felt deeply that we needed to have these led by New Mexican educators. So we also issued an application where we asked for teachers from across New Mexico who are interested in this work to come forward. We had 60, I think it's just under 65 educators who led the work in writing and revising the standards. They looked at the national standards, they looked at 10 other state standards and other resources. And then they went through the work of establishing draft standards after that. And now we're just at the point where we have those honed. We have some draft standards. They're actually published on our website, and they will be issued in rule format on September 28th. And when I say they're issued in rule format, what that means is that's how we actually adopt standards through rule at the Public Education Department. Once they're established in rule format, we actually are opening it up for a 45-day feedback and comment space. So we invite all constituents, all community members, family, educators, students themselves to write in and provide critique, support, what they would like us to address or think about, because these are draft, right? And then it's our obligation to go back and revisit them.
Okay, so when is the public comment ending? What day?
Oh, that's a good question. 45 days after September 28th.
Okay.
I need to do the math there.
All right. So I want to talk with you. You mentioned that there was under 65 teachers across school districts in New Mexico, charter schools as well, that were involved in helping ask the right questions and come up with this information. But there was also a competitive bidding process that the state put forward to hire an organization to help you with this process. What organization did the state hire?
That's correct. We did. We hired the American Institute of Research, which has also led the development of standards across several states.
Okay. Now, obviously, your teachers are taking the time to share their thoughts and questions, examine many different things. You've got the help of higher education officials as well. What can you share with us on where this process is going to go? We have the public comment period that is happening right now, that's underway, where folks can share their ideas. But do you have an idea about when you think these can actually be implemented?
Certainly. So one other thing I want to mention, Anthony, we will have a public hearing. In addition to that public comment period, there's actually a public hearing where folks can vocalize and share with us their perspective as well. And we need to take that into consideration as well. It's an obligation on our part. And then we will revise the standards based on the feedback that we receive, and they will be published, we're thinking, at the very end of December of this year. That means that these standards will not be implemented until next school year. And instead, this coming spring, what we will do is take the time to look at what types of professional development will educators need, what types of resources will they need in implementing and moving these standards forward. And we'll be writing what's called an instructional scope that allows them to organize this as curriculum units for their classroom.
New Mexico is facing a teaching shortage, a substitute teaching shortage as well. Some teachers are having to take their planning period and fill in for other teachers and lead other classrooms and be in charge of them as well. How are teachers in New Mexico going to have enough time to learn these new standards so they can implement them?
That's a great question, and part of our charge, I think, moving forward. A couple things about that. The answer to that is not just about helping teachers find time and paying them for their professional development time, but also in building out the educator ecosystem and how are we providing avenues by which others can enter the field. So I'll sort of answer it in two ways. The first is we need to do some due diligence in funding others in entering the field. So for instance, we have this new Educator Fellows program to the tune of $37 million, where we're asking and funding anyone who's interested in becoming an educational assistant. We will pay for your salary and your benefits. We'll also give you a $4,000 stipend to go back to school, and all licensure and background fees. So really all-inclusive supportive system to get more people into the field. So that's one thing, I think. And in addition, really supporting school districts with subs and substitute training and the processes and getting substitutes in to support educators. But the third thing is also working creatively, I think, to recognize educator time. I think as these school districts have received extra money from the federal government, one of the best things that money can be used for is valuing professional development time and supporting educators in the work that they're doing. They are critical to the success of students and the success of our schools. So as much as you can do to provide extra and robust stipends and funding for them in valuing that time, because it is going to be, you're exactly right, extra time that is already very limited and they're exhausted. So how do we value them as much as possible?
Okay, well, you just mentioned that teachers are exhausted. I want to hear from you. We're in a pandemic. What happens if things get worse? What happens if things are more challenging for teachers and your department and school districts across the state have to take action to protect students, faculty, and staff from COVID-19? Does the state have a contingency plan on implementing these standards if that should happen?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question, Anthony. I don't have a contingency plan right yet, but I do think that would be on the table for sure, right?
So the state doesn't have a plan, is what you're saying, if things get worse, with helping out teachers who are already exhausted, which you said.
That's not what I'm saying. What
Okay.
I'm saying is...
Clarify. Can you clarify?
I sure can.
All right.
What I'm saying is, if for some reason the pandemic got worse, although we're seeing national trends and feedback from CDC as well as researchers that we don't think that's actually going to be the case. But if that were the case, that certainly would be on the table. And we are trying to pivot as much as possible to support educators when there are things that are that we're asking of them that are mandated, or are initiatives that we think will help support get us out of where we are in terms of the achievement gap. So it's a tricky thing to be able to support educators and value their time while also recognizing that we have the intense pressure from the lawsuit and an obligation for our students and families to move them up academically.
All right, you bring up the lawsuit. You mentioned earlier in the interview that you think these standards could really help address the needs of that lawsuit that the state has been ordered to address. There are some groups out there that are concerned, though, about the state and how it is reacting to that lawsuit. Transform New Mexico, a coalition of education, tribal, and community leaders that are working to address this issue and ensure that the state meets those obligations that the state judges ordered, tweeted on September 21st that it's been 3 years since the Yazzie ruling and the state is nowhere close to meeting the constitutional rights of students. But they've spent millions fighting the court decision, money that could have gone to schools. Listen to what our students and educators still need. This is what Transform New Mexico tweeted out. I'm quoting that tweet. So I'd like to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this and what they're saying? And do you think the state and your department has done enough to address this issue with the lawsuit?
Sure. I'll answer in two ways. So the first is you cannot do enough in 3 years ever, period. So no, our agency has not done enough, nor would any agency do enough, because in order to get out of 500 years of historical oppression and a public education system that has not been sufficient requires much more than 3 years. So that's a pretty clear answer that no, we've not done enough, and we will not do enough as of next year. We won't do enough as of the year after, but we're certainly going to keep trying because you need to keep moving forward, and it requires a sustained effort. I will say, though, that within the past 3 years, we've made some significant inroads, and that's the important work. We have to begin to deconstruct systems that are inequitable and then rebuild systems. And both of those things are important.
Well, what about when the state's spending millions of dollars to fight the lawsuit? Do you think that that was the right move and sends the right message to these students who the lawsuit is trying to protect?
Yeah, I don't think that we're spending millions to fight the lawsuit. I think, in fact, we'd like to support, and that's why we didn't, the governor chose not to push back or deny the claims. I think we all really believe that we need to rectify and support and build out a school system that supports all students, particularly those that were named in the lawsuit.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes left. Let's dive into these revisions and what to expect. Perhaps we could start with elementary school. What do you see being the big major changes that you think could help with these new standards?
Certainly. So within standards, we have what we call anchor standards. And the anchor standards are sort of the overarching tenets, if you will, where other performance indicators, aspects that we want, content knowledge, specific skills that students have. And within these anchor standards, we've expanded beyond simply history, geography, civics, and economics to include two more that are critical for student success and more robust approaches to education and deeper learning. Those two are ethnic, cultural, and identity studies, which is something that's reflected in many states and in the national standards, and really about the individual and their relationship within community. And then the second anchor standard is inquiry. And that's actually about the practice of understanding what it means to be a historian, the practice of analysis, and the practice of looking at things through multiple lenses.
Okay. Coming out of elementary school, what is the goal for students to really take away from these new standards?
I would say that you'll see some very good similarities or some close similarities between the high school standards that we already have and these new ones, with a few marked differences. That is, there's some updates in terms of actual events. So for instance, 9/11, right? That's a major historical impact event that we need to ensure is in part of the story of ourselves and our nation, our state. You'll also see some interesting nuances in terms of really understanding the rebuilding of the United States in terms of industry and immigration, and some identification there. You'll see sort of the differences in terms of understanding the impact of colonialism on our Native and Indigenous students in New Mexico.
Okay, what about junior high, moving on to junior high, that critical moment between elementary school and high school? What are some new standards that are going to be implemented there?
Sure. You'll see, again, the difference between Indigenous peoples in North America and the impact in terms of colonization. You'll see a more expansive approach in 7th grade around the emergence of pueblos and tribes and earliest New Mexicans, and then what happens when Spaniards enter the Americas in the Spanish colonial period. So a much more historically accurate reflection of that actual time period.
Okay, now high school, obviously you mentioned this is going to be a time where students may see some big changes when it comes to social studies. You mentioned civics being a major part of that students are going to really learn from. A major overhaul with civics, more civics. What is going to be implemented in high school that hasn't been before?
That's a good question. So let me actually pull up the standards so that I can pick something that might be exact for you.
Yeah, you mentioned civics being a major overhaul with this system. Obviously,
Sure.
High school students becoming more aware of what's happening in our world. We've seen high school students become activists and become more engaged in their communities through social media, through other ways. They're also starting to vote when they leave high school as well. So what are we going to see with the changes there?
That's right. Okay, so for instance, a high school civics standard 1, which is civic and political institutions, you'll see a few performance standards that look like this. So for instance, one says, distinguish the powers and responsibilities among local, state, indigenous, national, and international civic and political institutions. What's different there markedly is the inclusion of our indigenous communities, really recognizing sovereignty as a role in terms of civic institutions, and as well as the idea of international and national relationships. And that's something I think that's sort of new and a broader understanding for students as they move into their space in New Mexico. You'll also see something along the lines of evaluate procedures for making governmental decisions at the local, state, national, and international levels, analyze historical, contemporary, and emerging means of changing societies that would promote protecting common good and protecting rights. You'll see a broader range of what it means to participate in civil discourse, to promote greater understanding around historical, contemporary, and future opportunities. So it's a really broad, strong representation of civics within 4 standards, both roles and responsibilities in civic life, civic dispositions and democratic principles, the processes, rules, and laws that we leverage and or use, and civic and political institutions in general.
There's been a lot of reporting done on misinformation in our society, dealing with our elections, dealing with understanding our political process. Is there anything addressing misinformation so students can become aware to check sources on the information that they're getting?
Yes, and actually that's not at the high school level, that's younger. I think that's a critical skill for us to begin with at about 4th grade. Because as you said, students are accessing social media from a very early age.
Okay, now I also recognize that there was a citizenship part at the elementary school level, I believe it was. New Mexico has students that may not be citizens of the United States. Is this going to be implemented in a way where we're not leaving anybody out, or students can feel a part, everybody can feel like they belong in that conversation that's happening?
Certainly. I think that we are very mindful of attending to language and being very respectful in terms of our immigrant population. Immigration is really recognized as a something that that has for a long time been a part of our national history and state.
Okay, now where can folks read these drafts, the drafts of what these proposed revisions are? Where can they go to find out more information about this?
Certainly. You can locate these draft standards at the public education webpage. And when you arrive at the public education department webpage, under offices and programs, you'll find a link to Literacy and the Humanities Bureau, or the Literacy and Humanities Office. And when you link on that, you'll see social studies because it's part of that bureau. And click on social studies. You'll see actually the process that we've gone through, and then you'll see a link to the actual standards as well.
Dr. Gwen Perea Warniment is Deputy Secretary of Teaching, Learning, and Assessment with the State of New Mexico's Education Department. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us about these changes.
Of course. Thank you, Anthony.
And we want to thank you for joining us for another episode of Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Murnell. We will see you next time.